I'm going to introduce Dr. Delia Hagen. So Dr. Delia Hagen is an historian of the North American West. Raised between Northern California and Western Montana, she received her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, her MA from the University of Texas, and her AB from Dartmouth College. A consulting scholar, her diverse work ranges from theoretical analyses of international structural developments like settler colonialism to contextualized microhistories of a single historic site. Her presentation today, Revisioning the West, Deep Mapping Non-White Montana, explores the process and implications of a series of intensive spatial history projects, including place-based projects on Montana's urban Indigenous, Black, Chinese, and Mexican populations. These projects radically remap Western places and transform our understanding of Western space and history, as well as the history of underrepresented communities and of the United States writ large. So welcome, Dr. Hagen.
So I'm just going to start off with two caveats. One is that I was not expecting a handheld mic, and I gesticulate a lot when I talk, so I'm really going to have to try to rein that in. And it's a evolving practice for me here at this point. And the other is that my PowerPoint isn't going to exactly match my talk, because as I got into writing this talk, I started going deeper and deeper and deeper. But since that's part of the point, I think it's okay. So I'm really happy to be in Great Falls this afternoon to talk with you about Revisioning the West, Deep Mapping Non-White Montana, which is a title I came up with last spring when conference proposals were due, thinking I'd like to use this opportunity to explore the process and implications of the work I've been doing for literally decades now on a series of intensive spatial history projects. These have included place-based projects on Montana's Indigenous, Black, Chinese, and Mexican American populations. I wanted to look at these projects together, to place them into conversation intentionally. I wanted to explore them collectively, to see what they might tell us when consciously considered as a whole, to see how they might together radically remap Western places, together transform our understanding of Western space and history, our understanding of the history of underrepresented communities, and our understanding of the history of the United States and beyond. As we'll see, Great Falls is the perfect place to dive into deep mapping in non-white Montana. And thinking about Fort Benton at the same time is a perfect accompaniment as well. Both of these places figure prominently in the history of Montana, of course, but especially so in the history of non-white Montana. In that exploratory vein, this talk is itself part of the process of understanding some of the ways these projects might shift our thinking, some of the things they might teach us. It's part of a first look, an initial contemplation of big questions raised by a body of work, not an authoritative pronouncement of answers to those questions. It is itself perhaps a mapping process, putting together the different place-based pieces to better see how they change the way we understand where we are, the way we understand place, space, and history together, to better see how, by reconstructing these Black Montana geographies, by rebuilding these Montana Chinatowns, by reclaiming these Indigenous Montana landscapes, we might re-envision our history and place. We might re-envision Montana and the West. As I started thinking about this talk and this topic more intentionally, I've started to see more specifically how this shift in fundamental understanding in the way of seeing a place entwines not only with my professional and intellectual trajectories, but also my personal trajectory in understanding Montana, in understanding its place in history, and in understanding the meaning and power of place-based history itself. My talk, as a result, became far more personal than I first imagined, and I apologize if it seems kind of self-absorbed. So I should step back for a minute and talk about my background a bit before we start talking about the process and product of these different mapping projects and about what we can learn from them when we consider them collectively. So I grew up sort of unusually, dividing my time between California and Montana, moving every 6 months or a year between my mom's place in Berkeley, where I was born, and my dad's place in Missoula, where I first moved when I was 6 months old and we had a mining claim on McCormick Creek up 9 Mile. On our countless drives between homes for holidays and longer stays, we traced a route through Idaho and Nevada, sometimes Oregon and Washington, over and over and over, back and forth across the West. We drove innumerable rigs in every kind of situation. Really, the only consistent factor about these dozens and dozens and dozens of trips might be that we broke down every single time. Looking back on growing up this way in the West, from the perspective of this discussion, I can articulate what I might have described differently then. And that is that my understanding of my two homes, of these two Western places, and of the space in between them was racialized. By that I mean, at a most basic level, even as a child, I thought of California and of urban places as Black, Mexican, and Asian space, as well as Jewish, like my mom's family. Montana, on the other hand, was rural, the country, a place where the non-white population was Indian and where there were almost no Black people or Mexican people or Asian people and very few Jews. At a more localized level too, I understood space as somewhat racial. For instance, growing up in the Bay Area in Berkeley, in the urban center around Oakland and San Francisco, the city seemed more racially diverse and more mixed than outlying places like Pinole out in the valley, the suburbs, where they had really good softball teams, but very few people of color. And in Montana, I knew too that while my neighborhood, which back then was Missoula's kind of ghetto, the north side, on the wrong side of the railroad tracks, the Northern Pacific Railroad tracks, and barricaded at the other end by the interstate, that while the north side had lots of Indigenous residents, other neighborhoods in town did not. I also understood in my kid consciousness that in the main, the Indian community lived on the Flathead Reservation or on the other Indian reservations where we visited and went to powwows, like Browning Indian Days up at Blackfeet. But above all, despite these sort of geographical gradations in kid brain consciousness of race, space, and place, I mainly thought of California as racially mixed and Montana as white. Native people were very much a part of my Montana life, and my consciousness of Montana as a place always included Indigenous people, but Native space, as I understood it, was very much delimited, demarcated, and contained. It was only in specific, tightly bound spots in my mental map of Montana. It was in my neighborhood, fenced between the tracks and the freeway, and it was on the reservations, whose borders were marked by signs declaring them to be Indian areas you were crossing into. Outside of those areas, as I understood it, Montana was white. So from this upbringing, I went off to college in Ivy League, New England, also a very racialized place and experience, but not one we're going to go into here. And there I ended up majoring in history before returning to Montana after graduation, when I moved to Billings and started working as a rural community organizer for the Northern Plains Resource Council. Over the next couple of years, my intimacy with Montana spaces, with the people and history in Montana places, deepened. My job had me endlessly on the road all over eastern Montana, sleeping on couches and floors on old family farms and ranches from Plentywood to Ekalaka and back. And I got to know those plains communities, the people and roads and towns and rural areas pretty well. Back home in Billings, I lived in a 100-year-old cabin in the heart of the South Side, which, like my own North Side neighborhood, was on the wrong side of the Northern Pacific Railroad tracks and barricaded at the other end by the interstate. And which, like my own North Side neighborhood, housed a lot of Billings working class and people of color. Really, in many ways, the South Side felt like one of the most diverse and integrated neighborhoods I'd ever seen. And mind you, I spent a lot of my youth not only in the Bay Area and in Mexico, where we traveled often, but also in New York City, where my mom's family lives. But in Billings, my tiny little log cabin sat in the backyard of 7 identical small houses on the same property. And even just in my front yard, my neighbors were a pretty equal mix of white, Black, Mexican, and Native people in a variety of mixed household and family arrangements. It was a really remarkable thing for me to realize when I settled there as a 21-year-old and discovered such diversity, such deep diversity in Montana, in white Montana. From that intimate Southside situation and my endless traversing of eastern Montana for the Northern Plains Resource Council, I headed to graduate school, going south to the Southern Plains, to Texas. In Austin, I planned to study Western history and borderlands. And when I arrived, after an August drive across the dry West in an old beat-up teal green Mustang, I found a letter in my mailbox offering me a job at the university's Population Research Center, where I became a researcher on the Great Plains Project. The Great Plains Project was a long-term, large-scale, multi-campus data research project on 10 Great Plains states, shown in this map, which included Montana. Working on that vast, complex project with its region-wide data-level approach taught me many things. But for our purposes here, one of the main things was thinking about space, about mapping, and about the many things we might explore and learn by doing so. As I wrapped up my master's, family care obligations pulled me back to Montana, and I began working for Historical Research Associates, a consulting firm based out of Missoula. This proved to be the first of many shifts between academic and public history for me. Moving between academia and place-based public history and historic preservation has defined my professional path ever since. But of course, I didn't know that at the time. Back then, I was just stoked to find a paying job in Montana in history. At HRA, I worked in both the litigation support and cultural resources management divisions. And my first fieldwork assignment was a survey of cultural resources along a highway department project on US Highway 89, which runs north-south along the Rocky Mountain front. The project corridor started just north of the Sun River Valley and St. Peter's Mission, where a man named Louis Rial had taught school in the early 1880s. It ended at the southern edge of the current Blackfeet Reservation, the American Blackfeet Reservation. Cultural resource surveys require writing a historical context to use for evaluating the significance of buildings and sites that might be impacted by the project. And as a standard part of my research for these contexts, I would ask around and try to find local elders and history buffs who could shed some light on regional development in the small towns that dotted the highway. At the cafe in Choteau, my waitress told me about a guy named Al Wiseman, who was a local historian, a curator, and a carpenter, as well as an elder of the Métis Indigenous people, whom I had never heard of, and who Chris Latreille was talking about. I called Al and went out to visit him and his wife Elaine at their home in the foothills northwest of Choteau near the Teton River. Both Al and Elaine are members of the Little Shell Chippewa tribe, which is based here in Great Falls, and they both come from longtime Front Range Métis families. Elaine's maiden name is Gray. They dedicate much of their time to preserving and sharing the history of their ancestral communities. And for many years, they were caretakers of the cemetery at the old abandoned Métis settlement located up Teton Canyon. So I went to visit them, and over the course of a sunny fall afternoon, spent first at their kitchen table and then driving up Teton Canyon to the cemetery, Al told me about the Métis. The Métis, Al told me, were a group of mixed race French Chippewa Indian people who lived in the US-Canadian borderlands of the Northern Plains. In the second half of the 19th century, they fought two major battles with Canadian forces. The first along the Red River of the North in 1869, and the second 16 years later in present-day Saskatchewan. After the second conflict, Canada hung their leader, Louis Riel, the aforementioned teacher at St. Peter's Mission. As a Francophile and a student of Indian history, I was fascinated by Al's dramatic and unfamiliar story. And I couldn't believe I'd never heard it before. I mean, I grew up in Western Montana, and my dad was sort of an eccentric who did a variety of things to make a living, including trading antique saddles and cowboy gear. He also liked to camp, so we spent many weeks of my childhood driving down back roads in our 67 Cadillac convertible or our 1979 red Ford pickup, hitting farm auctions and looking for old ranchers who might harbor treasures in their basement or in their barns. I was fascinated by the state's heritage from an early age, and I got into it more deeply as a history major at Dartmouth. And then I worked afterward as a rural community organizer, traveling all over the eastern half of the state. But in all my Montana adventures, I had never encountered the Métis. By all means, I should have. Montana is part of the heartland of Métis territory, and Louis Riel, maybe the most famous person in Canadian history, was in many respects a Montanan. I knew my state intimately. I had a master's degree in American history. I specialized in borderlands and the West and the Great Plains and in Indian history. Why in the world didn't I know about Riel and the Métis? The answer, it turned out, has to do with terminology, especially with names. When Canada and the US colonized the Northern Plains in the late 19th century, the Métis became categorized as Canadian. And since national boundaries often determine the histories we learn, I'd never even heard of one of the most important aspects of Montana history. It was supposedly a Canadian story, not an American story. This fundamental erasure of Métis history from the heart of their territory, from the narrative of Montana, proved to be, in fact, a defining part of that history. I learned this in subsequent years when I returned to grad school, this time at UC Berkeley, and wrote my dissertation, which started from the historical seeds planted by Al that afternoon in Teton Canyon and grew to be the story of Northern Plains borders and the people in between. That dissertation was a transnational history of colonialism and mixed mobile Indigenous people in the borderlands of the Northern Great Plains from 1860 to 1940. It showed how, after the American and Canadian invasion of the region, both countries incorporated Plains inhabitants through treaties and state status categories that created mutually exclusive, spatialized legal classifications like American or Canadian, Sioux or Cree, Indian, citizen, alien. In the borderlands, many mixed mobile Métis were denied the legal status and rights of either enrolled Indians or of non-Indian settlers and were rendered stateless. This was especially true in the United States, where colonizers focused on French aspects of Métis groups to define them as foreign. Métis statelessness rested on their discursive displacement, their narrative erasure from the groups and lands of La Nation Métis. According to colonial authorities, the mixed and mobile Métis had no enduring affiliation with or claim to any racial or tribal group, any place or territory. Statelessness codified this erasure. Colonial boundaries of race, place, tribe, and band conveyed land rights. And stateless indigenes were not just landless or homeless, their mere presence was forbidden everywhere. Discursive erasure of Métis from their traditional communities thus came full circle. Their presence denied, they were excluded from state status categories and legally had the right to occupy no place, no space. But my dissertation did not start out that way. It started out as an examination of tribal role-making at a single reservation in North Dakota. I'm gonna sound a lot like lunch here. I had learned from Al that Little Shell Chippewa and many Montana Métis communities traced their current landlessness and long lack of tribal recognition to 1892, when their families were left off of the original roll for the Turtle Mountain Chippewa Reservation in North Dakota. So I started there and I began following the people in the story and the sources that offered glimpses of them. Al had made clear, however, that even though the local Métis community had been around Montana a long time, it maintained ties to Canada well into the 20th century. He considered the 1885 events in Saskatchewan a turning point in his own history. After the Northwest conflict and the hanging of Riel, as he put it, things fell apart for the Montana Métis. Americans labeled the Métis and the Cree Canadian, and the Army harassed, hunted, and deported them. They tried to get permission to live on American Indian lands like the Flathead Reservation, but these efforts foundered on allegations that they were either Canadian and didn't belong in the US, or that they weren't really Indian. Their endurance in places like Teton Canyon testified to the insecurity of their existence in the States after 1885. Mountain canyons like that carved by the Teton River offered places to hide, when deportation campaigns periodically brought soldiers looking to round up what they called Canadian Cree. So I started doing research with this basic context as my background. That is that the Métis were connected to the Little Shell Chippewa and to the Turtle Mountain Chippewa and to the Rocky Boy Chippewa Cree, and that Montana communities were connected to North Dakota locales and American communities were connected to places in Canada. And all of this had been going on since at least the 19th century and had lasted well into the 20th. As you can imagine, my initial research keyword kit was quite extensive. I had to look for all these terms alone and in combination, and also for their many possible period synonyms and primary sources, like British Indians or Red River half-breeds. And I came up with a bunch of documents. But at some level, my abundant primary sources obscured or actively erased the social and spatial connections reflected in my expanding keyword kit. Documents from the Office of Indian Affairs frequently referenced British half-breeds, and official correspondence often called for their expulsion from reservation communities where they supposedly didn't belong. In 1896, Montana newspapers published tons of stories about Little Bear and his Canadian Cree being sent home. Since I knew that these groups were related and intermixed, the descriptions I found in primary sources seemed simplified and inaccurate. Like all 19th century Northern Plains Indian bands, Little Bear's band fluctuated in terms of membership, and it included people from Métis and Chippewa communities, and people from Montana and North Dakota, and sometimes people from Idaho and Minnesota and Wisconsin. It couldn't accurately be called only Cree or only Canadian. Why wasn't that in the newspaper? Why didn't Indian agents openly ponder these connections when considering whether people had rights to live on reservations? I soon realized that these questions were themselves a critical part of the Métis story. The primary sources in front of me weren't just describing contemporary events, they were actively shaping them through the use of language. Headlines about the Canadian Cree, for instance, were part of the colonial process in which nation states categorized the Cree as Canadian and tried to erase the enduring connections between Cree people and so-called American populations and places. Moreover, the headlines referred to groups that included not only Cree, but also, at the very least, people of Chippewa, French, and British descent. Newspaper articles used a misleading language of limits. They discursively displaced and confined Indigenous communities, enclosing them in linguistic borders that implied discrete and separate nations, races, tribes, and bands, and tied each of them to exclusive geographies. Canadian Cree, Turtle Mountain Chippewa, British half-breeds, all these socially and spatially discrete categories ignored and ultimately impeded the mixture and mobility that characterized the integrated Indigenous communities who inhabited the 19th century Northern Plains. So instead of trying to simply fill in some of the historiographical gaps I had identified, which is what I started out doing, I began to focus on why those gaps existed in the first place. 10 years later, I finished. Throughout my many years of working on my dissertation, off and on as I bounced between public history consulting and academia, I noticed in sources here and there many more references than I expected to find in the white Montana of my mind to other non-white populations as well. And I developed something of a running rant about how someone needs to write a book about how Montana became white. Lo and behold, a few months after finishing my dissertation, I got a call from Kate Hampton at the Montana Historical Society about a project funded by a new National Park Service program aimed at increasing historic documentation of underrepresented communities. That project was a documentation of Black history and historic places in Helena. It was part of a larger project on Montana's African-American heritage that Kate had been spearheading for years. And in my own professional and intellectual trajectory, the Black Helena Project became the first of 5 major projects, including 2 book-length statewide studies I'd subsequently complete on the Black West, 3 of which focused on Black Montana. These projects exhaustively mapped Black presence across multiple Western states and cities at the level of individual properties for the more than 100-year period between 1860 and 1970, and produced an unprecedented body of documentation about Black lives in places where Black presence has long been erased and ignored. And they were a revelation. In the course of them, I dove deep into documentation of Black Montana from the early 19th century into the 1970s. This deep mapping of Black lives, of Black presence in places, showed that African Americans were an integral and prominent part of Montana history and have been so across space and time. It revealed how, in crucial ways, Montana is a fundamentally Black place. And by the same token, it revealed how Montana history is significant in African American history more broadly. It showed how Montana's Black past encompasses the entire state, all major cities, every county, and it extends from at least the early 19th century into the late 20th century. It showed how each of the state's major cities African Americans built autonomous local communities and how these urban clusters functioned as cores and anchors of a widespread, interconnected, statewide community that encompassed many smaller towns and rural sites as well. For much of the historic period, these dispersed places could be found in every county in Montana. In some of these places, Black people were among the earliest non-Indian residents. In quite a few of them, they became pillars of the community or ranked among the most prominent people in town. Belt is a perfect example of that. And it showed how throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, Black people were part of the definitive stories of the state, from the Lewis and Clark expedition to the fur trade, from the gold rush to the Battle of the Little Bighorn, from open range ranching to the homestead boom, from railroad building to town development to fundamental transformations in the wake of the Second World War. Black Montanans played a significant role in every major state economic sector, in the arts, in sports, and in the political, economic, social, and cultural history of every major city, many towns, and most counties. In sum, African-American history and historic places pervade the state, and the definitive stories of Montana are Black history. At the same time, Montana, for its part, is a significant space and place of African-American history writ large. Mapping Black Montana also documented the critical, ubiquitous context of white supremacy and structural racism, as well as the African-American community's multitudinous struggles against them. Among the many ways racism ravaged Black lives is erasure. Erasure from history, from how we know Montana and its past, is both a product and a practice of white supremacy. African Americans were prominent in Montana historically. They are underrepresented in the histories we tell and the written record we rely on as a result of racism and white supremacy. My work on the Black West became a revelation in other ways as well. That is, in thinking about methodology and about erasure and about resisting erasure, about documentation, deep place-based documentation as a powerful weapon in fighting erasure. On every one of my projects, I ended up going way deeper than I intended and taking way more time. And it felt kind of insane, partly because it was destroying my income, which is based on piecework. But I had trouble stopping because I felt that the documentation of this erased past, of these resilient people who built lives despite the horrific circumstances inflicted upon them, was a form of social justice. As this insane intensiveness prolonged project after project and stressed and impoverished me year after year, I began to see that there was not only a method to my madness, but that the madness itself was the method. That is, when erasure is the practice and the product, the degree of depth and extensiveness of documentation is the degree to which you combat it. When you're countering erasure, the deeper your map, the more layered and crowded it is, the more effective it is at resisting erasure, the more radically it remaps our past, the more it forces us to re-envision our place. This realization is kind of captured by comments I got in the course of my work on Black Montana. When I first started the project and would mention it to grad school colleagues, who, mind you, are American history professors, I invariably got the same response, some joke about how it's going to be a really short report. My old Austin roommate, for instance, a very bright guy whom I loved to death, asked, "Are you going to write a chapter on each Black person who lived in Montana?" But when I finished, having written hundreds and hundreds of pages that still left out so much of what I found, one reader commented that it was like reading the Old Testament, just going on forever and ever. It's so-and-so and so-and-so begat so-and-so. Suffice to say, it was not a short report. The projects on the Black West were methodologically instructive in many other ways as well. And I don't have time to go into them deeply here, but I do want to mention a couple things about how they reinforced to me the value of not only deep history, but of place-based history. For instance, in looking at Black Montana, the normal narrative is decline as the 20th century progressed, especially after the Second World War. But when you map the history in detail over time, you see that instead that such decline characterized certain places, but other places tell a story that is not only different, but opposite. In Montana, for instance, while the Black community as a whole declined drastically in that period, in Great Falls, with its military base, it boomed and flourished. The specific value of place-based history, and of looking especially at the built environment as a historical source, as a document, was reinforced too in my other Black West projects. In my work on the history of Black Wyoming, it was only by mapping every community and digging into the histories of almost every individual household that I discovered that one of Sheridan's residents, Charles Askew, was a veteran of the infamous Brownsville affair. His story, and specifically his Wyoming story, which is also a Montana story, there's his wife in Bighorn County, because they homesteaded across the state line, is highly significant in the history of race and racism in the United States. In the same vein, my work on the Black population in the Tri-Cities in Washington drove home the interconnectedness of these stories and the crucial role of place in reconstructing them and in shaping them. It was supposed to be about Black Pasco, which originated with the World War II Manhattan Project. But Pasco was the only place in the Tri-Cities that Black people were allowed to live. That fact alone made the history of Black Pasco the story of a much larger community that segregated its Black population in Pasco. A community in turn connected to a much larger narrative of World War II and the transformations it wrought the world over. And in writing about Black Pasco, I discovered too, or again, how instructive and powerful was the built environment. Black Pasco sits along the Northern Pacific Railroad tracks on the wrong side of the tracks, which barricaded off from the rest of town. That geography and that barricade loomed large in Black people's experiences of degradation, often appearing in stories of childhood terror, trying to get across through the dark concrete underpass that led to downtown. That underpass was a primary historic site of Black Pasco. And I knew that underpass the minute I saw it. It was the same underpass that terrorized me as a child trying to get from the north side to downtown Missoula. I knew that underpass and I knew those railroad tracks and I knew how they barricaded and did violence to working class people and people of color from Pasco to Billings and beyond. My work on borderlands Indigenous groups and the Black West led to a series of other projects on underrepresented, that is, erased communities in Montana, including Mexican American communities, Chinese American communities, and urban Indigenous communities. I had originally intended to talk about each of these in turn and about the major scholarly implication they held for their different fields, and about what they taught us about erasure and countering it, and about what they taught us about Montana, our place individually and together, and about how those lessons are intellectual, professional, and personal. But I'm out of time. So I just have to conclude with this, and that is, in every case, it is clear that active erasure is part of why we don't know this history, that there is much more history there than we know, and that these populations are fundamental to the history of Montana. It is clear, too, that the substantive findings of the projects have major scholarly implications for broader understanding and interpretation of the history of Mexican Americans, of Chinese Americans, of Native peoples of the West, of the United States. And it is clear that deep mapping and place-based history are key for understanding this past and this place. This is, for me, one of the primary lessons about this body of work. When you're talking about the history of underrepresented communities, depth itself is the revision. When you're talking about combating erasure, the deeper the map, the clearer the path to envisioning the past, re-envisioning our place, re-envisioning Montana, and re-envisioning the West. Thank you.